And we are live on YouTube with the February 26th edition of the Node.js modules team. If you're wondering why I emphasize the R in February, it is because it is the month of my birth, and I went over 20 years not realizing that there was a second R in there. And so it's a deep shame that I continue to live with. But that is not the topic of today's meeting. We're here to talk about modules. And we have a fairly full agenda. So let's jump right into it. As you can tell, I'm stalling because I don't have the agenda in front of me. The first thing we have on the agenda is disable conditional exports self-resolve warnings. Does anybody want to take this first item to discuss it?
I can cover it.
Go for it, Guy. Thank you.
Sure. So as we discussed in the last meeting, we had issues coming up with projects like Preact that are now shipping exports in their package.json, which means that users who are running Node.js 13 are getting these warnings when they're running. And another case came up where I had a user of ES module Lexer who was asking for the main to point to the ES module file. And I indicated to them that exports would be the better way to do that since there's a type module and I want backwards compatibility for my package. And they created a PR, added export support, and then immediately I had users posting issues saying that there was an issue around having these warnings. And in fact, Snowpack weren't able to move forward with the work with using the project until we could get the warnings removed by reverting adding exports to the package. So like that was just my experience and some of the experiences we've seen. And if we can just get to a point now where we can remove these warnings, then it'll truly allow people to experiment with this stuff. And the thinking around that is that, especially coming up, if we want to be thinking about backporting to 12 in April, we want to be sure that there is real world feedback, real world usage feedback. And we're not going to get that while exports is giving this warning, because packages like these are going to resist publishing and resist driving down and getting that usage going. So the PR was to remove the warnings for conditional exports and remove the warnings for self-resolution, which is also an export feature. And then in addition, someone brought up that we should actually remove the experimental modules warnings as well. So I thought it's probably a good time to discuss that as well. So this kind of ties into last meeting where we said that we should create an issue to discuss timelines around removing these warnings. Do we remove them all together? When are people comfortable with removing them? Does everyone agree that we should remove conditional export warnings now? That's the topic. Don't all jump in at once.
So yeah, I'll just chime in a bit thinking about it. Like, I guess the balance here that we need to maintain is ensuring that like folks using these are aware that they are experimental. So, you know, there have been a handful of occasions where people have jumped into issues of breaking changes that we've made, pointing out, oh my God, you made like a breaking change, and we can point at the warnings and we can point at the documentation as, you know, reasoning for doing this. Now, with that said, I don't think that we're planning on making any other massive changes to the interface for conditional exports. And just to make sure that we're on the same page here, like it is conditional exports and self-resolve that we're specifically thinking about removing the warning for, not the warning for the ESM module implementation as a whole. And so I think that at this point, I would personally be comfortable with us removing those warnings on 13. I'm less clear about whether or not we should move it on 12, but I think like remove it on 13, see what happens, and then like wait a little bit before backporting those changes. What do people think about that? We've got Jan and Jordan with their hands
Can I just ask a question about that?
Yeah.
On 12, they wouldn't see the warnings unless they also did -- experimental modules, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Not if they. I'm not sure if that's also from. Actually, we did change it so that conditional exports only applies for experimental modules on CommonJS.
Yeah, none of
there was a brief bug in 12.6.0 around that warning, but I believe that's now fixed.
Yeah, so at least the intention on 12 is that none of these features are accessible or usable without the experimental modules flag, which throws the experimental modules warning. I think there's something to be said about like keeping things consistent between 12 and 13 there, but I would probably want to like have a little bit of time with it on 12 before we waterfall. Jan, your hand is up.
Yeah, definitely a +1 on removing the warnings. Also, as an additional, sorry, throat. As an additional thing to consider here is also that the effect was supposed to be that people are aware that the feature is experimental, and so they see the warning if they've used the feature. The effect in practice has been that people found a magical way to construct the export syntax so that they don't trigger the warning. So they're still using the experimental feature, but just go out of their way to make sure that the warning doesn't get locked. So I think removing the warning right now kind of matches the world. It is what is actually happening. The feature is out there. People are writing package JSON files that are referencing the semantics of the feature. Right now, it's just painful that they have to write it in a very specific way so they don't accidentally trigger the warning, and they do. This makes it official that yes, that is the state of the world.
Jordan, do you mind if I ask Jan a quick question before you go? So I guess the thought that I have here, and it's not necessarily changing my take on it, but it seems like the warning actually accomplished part of its goal, in which like people seeing the warning and being annoyed by it came back to us to let us know that they were annoyed by it, which in turn that actually let us know a handful of these larger projects that were adopting it. So there is a risk in removing the warning now that we would potentially stop directly receiving that feedback. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there that, well, it is annoying. There's kind of like a catch-22 here though, because like there won't be more adoption without it.
Just to clarify, the reason why I brought it up was not because of one of those larger projects, but because of me randomly finding a GitHub issue of a smaller project that saw what the larger project did. So we didn't know about it. They like once one of the larger projects ran into it and it became, in quotation marks, public knowledge, the warning is no longer reaching us because they search, they Google, they find the issue, they make the change, they, in the commit message, they say work around the annoying warning message, and that's it. So I think,
I guess the thing for that though is they are writing things in such a way that in CommonJS, they are arguably not using any of the experimental features. I realize that that's pedantism, like I'm being pedantic about it, but yeah, I think we should remove the warning. But I do think that there has been value in having the warning.
So the point of the warning is to let people know they're using experimental features. That's the author of the package who's doing that. The consumers of the package are not using experimental features, and in most cases. And so the first thing is that the warning is mistargeted right now. Adding exports is a breaking change unless a bunch of very specific criteria applies. Like it's definitely possible to make adding exports not be a breaking change, but I'm quite sure that if I dig into Preact, I can like demonstrate multiple ways that 3.1 has breaking changes as a result of adding exports that 3.0 did not. Like they can of course decide that they're not breaking changes and wave their hands, but like despite our warnings, pre-X developers who are experienced still use this experimental feature, not even in a new major version. And like on top of that, like your point is valid, Miles, that we do still hear about it when the consumers see the warning. But Jeffrey and Jan's point is also valid, that now that they know how to get around it, we're not going to get that anymore anyway. And then also, like, because the warning is not being surfaced to the people who can do anything about it, like, I don't think it's achieving much. So like, I think it was fine to add with a warning, but I also like think that that features like this that leak, they're not encapsulated, right? Like it's really hard to make these warnings have any effect. And so like at this point, they're out in the wild, things are using them. Like the fact that we can technically get rid of them or break them or whatever, to me is sort of irrelevant. Like we need a really good reason to want to do that, I think. And it doesn't seem like any such reason is forthcoming. So like I'd like to see us remove the warnings at this point.
Yeah. So the bit that I was going to add is, my understanding is for some of the warnings related to unsafe uses of the buffer API did do something like this, where it was only the use within your own package, but not within the dependencies that threw the warning. And we could do something like that. That is an option. And I guess like my question to the room is like, is it worth the engineering effort to do that, or should we just remove the warnings?
I mean, the challenge there too is that it's with use of the API, like that's going to happen with any exercising of your first party code. And so then that engineering effort has the desired effect. But with this one, unless they're using self-reference, like the self package name import, they're not actually using a feature in their own code. So even their tests are not going to trigger that warning. So unless they're using their own package name, they're never going to see the warning, no matter what effort we put into it. So I think specifically for this feature, that effort is not worth it because it won't have the desired effect at all.
Cool. Just really quickly, for the sake of time, Jan, you still have your hand up. I think we're almost ready to just go to like trying to reach consensus on this. Did you have, just for the sake of time, did you have specific things you wanted to add?
No, lower hand.
So does anyone object to us removing the warnings on 13 for conditional exports and self-referential modules? Cool. So does someone want to take on the pull request for that?
I already have a pull request for that. I actually bundled it up with removing the experimental modules warnings as well, to see if we could push it to that. But it sounds, Miles, like from what you were saying earlier, that your preference would be that we just remove these warnings for now,
Yeah,
and then come
absolutely.
back around on the full removal later.
Yeah, I do think that, like, yeah, I think we should tease these apart, personally.
I'll update the PR unless anyone wants to dig into that and try and argue for removing all the warnings. Otherwise, we can come back around on it.
Yeah, I would even say, since we have consensus on this one, that it would be better to start another thread specifically for removing the experimental modules warning, because that could derail things. So that's just my own thought.
I think it was actually Jeffrey who brought it up originally. I don't know if you want to go into that, Jeffrey, or
I brought up what?
in the PR, whether all modules warnings should be removed.
Guy, I'll make it really simple. I don't agree with removing the experimental modules warning yet, so it makes sense to separate them.
And I'd be personally interested in seeing the conditional exports warnings removed in as close as possible to the next Node 13 release. And so anything that can be done to accelerate that, I think, is good. And separating them seems like it will achieve that.
Yeah, I think we could get that. If that PR gets updated, we could get that landed before the end of the week. Jan, you have your hand up?
But I assume having a PR open to also remove the modules warning would be good given our timeline, because eventually we need to do it and there's only so many weeks left.
Yeah, that's fine, but weeks left for what?
To remove the warning before we actually want to unflag everything.
So
Well, it is unflagged. You just mean to
The
remove
warnings would
warning.
have to be removed and shipped in 13 before we could backport that to 12. Is that what you're getting at, Jan?
Yeah, at least that's my assumption.
So without derailing too much, because we want to spend time on other things, Jan, I am not imagining we would be in a world where when we unflag on 12 in April that we are also removing the experimental modules warning from 12. I don't think that we will be there yet, personally.
That is actually news to me.
Sounds like we have an agenda item for the next meeting then for that.
So if we look at what we have on the agenda right now, we have basically like two things about workers. We have something about worker threads, extensionless workers, a lot of things around like workers and threads and hooks. We could try to get through those and get back to it. Get back to this issue later in this meeting if people want. We still have like almost 40 minutes.
Can I just ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
So we're going to remove the warnings for conditional and self-reference in 13. Are we going to backport that to 12, even though in 12 the whole implementation is still flagged?
I think that that's a completely separate discussion from what we discussed today.
Okay, so should we, do we need another issue for that or whatnot, or can we? Is there a reason we would want to have like conditional exports throw a warning in 12 when they're already using the experimental models flag?
I think it's a different story because on 12, nobody is accidentally triggering it because it's flagged. The problem on 13 right now is that it's not flagged. People can accidentally trigger it and then get a warning, even though they are not doing anything special.
Right, that's why I was assuming it wouldn't be controversial to just backport this removal of the warnings to 12.
Well, I think
They
it's
have to opt
both
into
not
it.
controversial to backport it, but also not quite as necessary because only people that use the flag will see the warning, and they already see warnings anyhow because they're using the flag.
Right.
So
I was just trying
I
to
don't
keep
think it's
the
critical to backport it for that reason.
I was just trying to keep 12 current with 13. Like the only difference being the experimental models flag, and that's it. You know what I mean? I'm assuming we're trying to do that.
Jeff, I agree with you on principle there, but especially when we're talking about things like warnings, when we're talking about things like stability index, it is a different story to make these changes to an LTS branch than to a non-LTS branch. And I'm not saying yes or no, but I think that it would be beneficial for all of us to separate the discussion of kind of timelines and what we do on those two branches.
All right, so we can make a separate like issue about this or whatever if you want.
Are people good with moving on to the next agenda item for now? Cool. So the next item we have here is add support for extensionless workers in ESM eval. This is an upstream PR. It got flagged for the modules agenda by me, but I think, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, that the work is actively happening there. Brad, I see you were one of the last people to comment. Is there a need for us to discuss this in the meeting today, or is the work that's happening on GitHub good enough?
There's just a need to be aware of it, I think. There are different ideas on how to take the PR. It seems like the way the PR is right now goes against one of the design, I would say, patterns we've been doing in this working group, where they're having the consumer define the format of a target resource. And so there are just alternatives in that thread, just to be aware that it exists. I don't think there's anything necessarily discussed that needs to happen here. Go to the issue thread.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Brad. I'm going to go ahead and remove the modules agenda issue label from that issue for now. And folks, now that you're aware of it, please, go in and take a look. And in general, there's lots of activity that happens on core. So in general, making sure that those things get labeled with the ES modules label, and when it's important to flag to the team that the appropriate labels are put in, is really helpful. So please, if you see stuff, label it. Very much appreciated. Okay, so the next thing that we have here is move ESM loaders to worker threads. That is Brad's PR. Brad, do you have anything to add to this for right now?
So it's been open for quite a while. I'd like to move it forward, but I still don't have a good hook for global attenuation, which was something that was brought up a while ago about it. At this point, I feel like we're just going to have to split the work and either move forward or completely block this until we find a way to attenuate well on the global. We've tried a few different approaches in the past. One was basically adding a hook for -- require style preloads. And that made the timing of Node's bootstrap incredibly difficult to wrangle, especially with how async hooks are set up. So I kind of abandoned that. And then I was going through and trying to figure out if we should just allow loader hooks to give a source text that can be run on Bootstrap. But if that does any async work, that also has problems with the Bootstrap. Basically, doing anything async inside the Bootstrap is really heinous because of how async hooks work. So I don't have a good solution for how to globally.
Is there no way to make it completely synchronous, the attenuation phase?
To an extent I can, but it would really be you must run in the script goal at that point.
That could be okay.
So we could do that, and then we could figure out interleaving later. It would be a sloppy script, not a common JS script. And then you could use strict yourself or whatever inside there. Same
so would you have access to require?
You need access to require.
Because if you want to hook built-ins, like a lot of APM use cases and things like that.
This is probably not for APMs.
Right, but it falls under the same bracket of attenuation features to want to be able to.
So the only
core.
reason this was brought up is because people are using dynamic instantiate to punch globals around. They aren't using dynamic instantiate to mutate existing modules.
Yeah, but it's not just for dynamic instantiate. It's also, a loader should be able to be self-contained. You shouldn't need to have the usage of the loader also invoking a require flag or something like that. And a lot of APM systems need to hook into the require system.
I think that's fine, but also going to be a separate feature.
Right, but I guess my argument is that that is a critical feature, and that if we drop that ability to hook into the require system from a loader, then that's not a good thing to do to loaders, because it just makes them less useful.
That feature is currently not supported. I'm just trying to get the loaders into a worker thread for this. I'm not prohibiting such a feature in the future.
Right, but right now it's possible. And so if that PR were to land, it's making something that's possible today. Loaders can hook into built-ins and require, something that's no longer possible.
They can do it through bootstrapping still, but I guess you just don't like that. If that's the requirement. I just think that PR is going to stay blocked for a long time.
So just as long as the attenuation script has access to either require or the list of built-in modules somehow.
Jan has their hand up.
Yeah, so I do agree with Guy that a global, some way of running code globally before any application code runs should somehow be able to access the built-ins, like the built-in modules, because that just captures a lot of current use cases. And yes, that overlaps with --require. So in theory, people who need that could just pass --require, and they could pass the loader as two separate arguments, one with the bootstrap code, one with the with the actual loader hooks. But to be fair, that kind of also applies to any other attenuation code that they could, in theory, pass using --require. So I think that's not necessarily a critical argument here. But if I think we are definitely getting to the point where we need to decide if we want to block this PR on bootstrap code, on attenuation code, on stuff that in theory could also be passed in require technically, or whether we are good moving forward with this, even though it means that loaders by themselves cannot do attenuation. They need a second flag, --require, to make it happen.
To be clear, we're not saying that that is true forever. We're just saying we don't have a good solution for the attenuation through loaders when this PR goes forward, if we want to move forward with it. But I absolutely do actually have a hard stop, and I have to go, so I can maybe do one more topic.
Okay, so are people happy to move on from this topic for right now? Okay, cool. The next one that we have up here is chartering the modules team. We also have loader hooks and patch instrument to module. Brad, since you're leaving early, do you have one of these that you prefer to talk about?
I don't have a preference.
Okay. Chartering the team. Let's just dig right into that. I think the next step, if we wanted to move forward with this, would be to make a pull request against the TSC repo. There is a document in there for working groups, which has a list of all active working groups, as well as what the scope of the working group is. I can dig up that document and drop it so people can take a look. So I think what we primarily need to do is reach consensus as a group about what we would outline in there. So like specifically, like if you look at build, for example, it's like the build working group's purpose is to create and maintain a distributed automation infrastructure. Responsibilities include producing packages for all target platforms, running tests, running performance testing and comparison, creating and managing build containers. So what we would need to do is like define the scope of what we're asking to be chartered for. You know, that could be like final arbitrator of decisions regarding the ESM module infrastructure in Node.js core, to other things. And I guess like one of the kind of core questions here is if you look at like streams, for example, it says the Streams working group is dedicated to support and improvement of the Streams API as used in Node.js and the NPM ecosystem. We seek to create a composable API that solves the problems of representing multiple occurrences of an event over time in a humane, low overhead fashion. Improvements to the API will be driven by the needs of the ecosystem, interoperability and backwards compatibility with other solutions and prior versions are paramount in importance. Responsibilities include addressing stream issues on the Node.js tracker, authoring and editing stream documentation within the Node.js project, reviewing changes to the stream subclasses within the Node.js project, redirecting changes to streams from the Node.js project to this project, assisting in the implementation of stream providers within Node, recommending versions of readable stream, messaging about future of streams. Personally, I find the scope that streams has to be a very similar scope to what we should probably be asking for. I like that it is very much about like responsibility. It's saying like, hey, we're gonna like take responsibility for doing these things, such as triaging issues and like the future work on the interface. But it's not necessarily saying in there like every single change to it needs to be approved by the group, at least not directly. Do folks have any particular thoughts about how this is phrased, and about kind of if you agree with the way in which Streams has documented things, and if we want to maybe do something based on that? Jan, you have your hand up, although I think that may be left over from the last topic. Hand is down. Anyone have any thoughts? Is anyone like particularly motivated to even do this? For what it's worth, there's lots of, like, we have been able to do everything that we've wanted to do without chartering. It hasn't really gotten in the way of us being productive, of shipping things. So I guess the flip side is, since it doesn't seem like folks have a lot of feedback on this, at least not immediately, are we good with just maintaining the status quo, or do people want to pursue chartering?
I mean, it'd be nice to be chartered. It's
Just
if
think
it
of
turns out, yeah, go ahead.
Just think of the fame and fortune. All right, go ahead.
No, I mean, there's like, there's a non-zero recognition piece, but I think that it's like, that's not really what's important, obviously. I think that the, if there's not a material difference, if it's just about like whether we have authority versus whether we are given, like conditionally given authority, then maybe it doesn't matter, but it still seems like the right thing to do. And there's going to be, I think there's going to be more decisions in the future that needs to have a separate group set aside to do it. And it seems like if the group is chartered, it will be easier to get that going than if we have to just kind of reconvene. Like if we just stop meeting because we're done, and then like in a year WASM modules show up and we have to like, you know, we have to kind of get the interested people back together. It seems like it'll be easier if we had to do that for me with a chartered group. But
for what it's
that's
worth,
just an intuition.
traditionally, Jordan, if chartered groups are not actively meeting and actively doing work, they get dechartered. So
Okay,
like from that logical perspective, that isn't really, it doesn't really work that way. So if the group were to disband and not be active, the TSC would decharter the group. So it's not like we charter and then we can go off and do whatever we want and then come back. Jeffrey, you have your hand up.
Forgive me for, I don't know if this quite is correct, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I was just thinking about that PR where there was the proposal for like type WASM and extensionless files and so on. And I was thinking that like, now that we've like kind of, you know, opened the floodgates a crack with expanding what can be in package.json with the additions that we've made, I feel like there might be lots of other groups that want to drive things into that crack. And so it might be good, I'm assuming it might be good to be chartered to have some element of restraint or like intelligent thought and design on how we want that public API to be, just because it's so hard to change, you know, because it's not like we can just make a breaking change in package.json in the next node version terribly easily, you know, or at least it's much more difficult. So if being chartered helps with that, then maybe it's worth being chartered.
But the general like collaboratorship probably wouldn't allow it. And again, I think looking at the streams group's charter is a really good one to compare to. And if we look at, I'm trying to see another one that's of a similar scope. But like specifically here with streams, there's nothing here saying that they own decisions for all changes to it. It's more like addressing the issues in the tracker, authoring and editing documentation, reviewing changes. So yeah, we would be able to, like, I personally would be uncomfortable, for example, with us saying our group owns a subsection of the code base and nothing can happen without our review or our work. But we do have enough members who are participating in core that can, effectively block things if we are uncomfortable with them. Wes has their hand up, so I'll let Wes go.
Well, I just wanted to mention with the package maintenance working group, we did do a proposal for an addition to package JSON, which then NPM folks ran with and made an addition which goes through no process. So like that kind of logic, while I think there would be some great benefit in having a group that considers those things explicitly and owns them, which would be not NPM, preferably. Not anything against them, just like that's, they have a lot of free reign there today. And I think having a group that did something like that, I don't think that that should matter for any individual, like other subsection group in a charter sense, right? Like it didn't matter for package maintenance working group at all. So I just want to point that out.
So here's a good question to the group. I don't have time to do this for a while. Does anybody want to take the time to draft up a potential charter that we would add to the working group's document that outlines what the responsibilities of our group would be if we wanted to charter?
I mean, I would be open to doing it, but I don't know when I can do it either.
I'm in the same boat where I'd happily do the work, but I'm not gonna have time for, I don't know, a few weeks at least.
Okay, so I guess we have two options here. Would folks like us to keep this issue open and explore it later? Does anyone object to the idea of chartering? Does anybody object to closing the issue that we have open right now to revisit it at a later point or removing it from the agenda?
I lightly prefer to leave things open until they're actually resolved.
Okay.
Yeah,
Cool.
I'd like to keep it open at least.
So let's keep it open. What I would say though, as a group, is that if no one is able to find the time to do the work, I think that it is a relatively strong signal that we are not being blocked in any sort of way by being chartered or not being chartered. And so unless someone wants to like kind of step up and do this work, I think at one point we'll just have to say, okay, it's just not happening and it's not a big deal. There's lots of other teams and groups that, I guess one advantage that we don't have right now is discoverability from the TSC working group README. But that's neither here nor there. I think we should move on for now. The next issue that we have here is loader hooks. Is there any update on where we're at with loader hooks? Does anyone want to take this issue on?
I thought this came up last time and we were supposed to take the tag off of it because nothing has changed, I think, in the last 2 weeks.
Anyone object to me removing the label from this issue? Okay, cool. Next up, patch instrument and module number 339. Does anyone have any updates on this?
I think this is what we were talking about was like, oh, we really need to focus on this. Like this is the last, I don't know about last, but like this is a kind of a prominent missing piece that we need to fill in on the ESM implementation. I don't know of anything that's happened in the last 2 weeks, but I think we were just trying to keep our focus on it.
Anyone have anything else to add for this one for right now? And if I'm following you right, Jeff, it makes sense for us to keep the modules agenda label on this one for now, or do we want to remove the label?
I mean, I don't know.
Does anyone object to me removing the label for now? Corey, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if this is the best way to approach this, but from NYC's perspective, one kind of issue I have with the current loader hooks is that there's no way to do multiple loader hooks, and specifically for my purposes, multiple transforms. So where a user would basically say, you know, here's transform 1, 2, and 3, and for Node.js to run those serially. I know it's been suggested that maybe there should be, you know, something in the user space that would manage the composition, but I'm not really sure how that would work, because realistically there could only be one if that's the plan from Node.js. So that's kind of my big concern with that feature right now.
I could speak to that a little bit, unless someone else wants to.
Go for it, Jeff. And then if people are okay with it, I'd love to time box this discussion to about 5 minutes or 6 minutes so that we still have a little bit of time to get back to the timeline discussion from earlier.
So Guy should probably speak after me, but like the reason that the API like passes the function at the end, like almost like a callback, was to make them composable so that like you could have them hooked one to the next. And that might still happen. Like someone, you know, just needs to do the work to figure that all out. There was, I think Jan might have said this, some skepticism that we could make that work in a reasonable way. And the argument went along the lines of, you know, the user would have to figure out some way to tell Node the order that to put these, say if you had 3 transform hooks in, and rather than Node coming up with yet another, you know, strange config file, you know, if you had 3 functions that are transform functions, well, you as the end user could write your own loader that has a transform function that within the function body of your transform function calls those other 3 functions. And then that way it's like you didn't write a config file, you just wrote code to make a parent function that calls the other 3. So that's something you could do now, assuming that the loaders that, you know, the 3 loaders that you want actually export their functions for use in this way. So that might be the best that we could do, but there is at least that, you know, unless or until a more formal composition effort goes on.
Okay, so for, I guess kind of my expectation was just by order of the argument. So if you use dash dash loader 3 times, then my expectation would be that you're basically adding to the stack of loaders. My issue with this with what you just said is, again, for NYC, it actually injects a transform into child processes. And I just don't see how I don't see how we deal with this situation where somebody is using NYC, but they're also using, say, TS Node or Babel. You know, basically, I'm not sure how we would manage that.
You should maybe open an issue with the specific use case, and we can talk about it there.
Okay, I will do. Thanks.
I think Jan has his hand up.
Yeah, I think I was a lot more bullish on multiple loaders and delegation before I actually tried to write multiple loaders and combine them in a practical way, because it is very easy to write loaders accidentally in a way that then is fundamentally incompatible with other loaders. So for example, things like, hey, I'm a TS transform, so I try to detect if what I'm currently trying to transform is TypeScript. So I check for the file extension, but then I have an HTTP loader that actually wants to load resources over HTTP and uses uses content type headers, and the file extension might not even be present, but it's still TypeScript. So now you need the TypeScript loader to somehow be able to get the information from the HTTP loader about something that the TypeScript loader should fundamentally not care about. So there is just the orchestration of multiple loaders, especially once you get into what many people are currently doing in Node, no matter how we feel about it, it is non-trivial. So I haven't so far seen a good story of how the user experience of using multiple loaders could be good, and the user experience of writing loaders that actually compose well with others can be good, while still having a simple, here's 5 different loaders, chain them in this exact order, and everything will be fine interface provided by Node. And that might just me being not be creative enough, but so far that is my impression. My impression is that it would be better for users if there would be a user-land solution that is basically like the Webpack of loader orchestration for these kinds of use cases. And that as if you just want to pass a single loader because it's your APM vendor and you don't do any wild runtime transformations of source code, the Node thing will be all you need. But if you have a complex development or test setup with multiple transformations that need to feed into each other, you kind of want to have something that's actually smart about where to apply which transforms and which features. And I don't think that Node is the place to do it, because Node is not something that loads complex config files or bootstrap files. So I just don't believe it's a good fit.
Okay, is there anything else to add to this right this moment, or are we ready to go back to discussing timelines? Okay, with no objections, going to timelines, and I think for the sake of a timeline here where we only have 7 minutes, I'm just going to share my really raw thoughts on this, and we can document this on GitHub. Folks may disagree with my thoughts here. I'm open to being wrong. I think a good example of this is our shift today about removing warnings. That wasn't something I thought that we would be doing as soon for the conditional exports, but here's where we find ourselves today. I think that removing the flag for experimental, the warning for experimental modules is something that we really should not be doing until we are fairly close to wanting to move towards stabilizing the API. I was even in a process where I was unsure that we would want to remove that flag immediately when 14 is being cut. We would probably want the flag to be removed by 14 LTS. I mean, the warning to be removed by 14 LTS. But I would want to see personally more general engagement and use of it, including use on LTS of the feature without a flag before we start to remove the warning. An API such as FS Promises, for example, which is like far less of an important API, had a warning significantly longer and was a warning that you would get even if the dependency was deep in your graph, if someone that you consumed used it. We have a history of having warnings in other APIs, such as HTTP2, such as worker threads. There is history of removing those warnings during LTS, so that is not an issue. I think that it is absolutely premature to be removing that warning come April in 12. I think it may even be premature to remove it from 13 and potentially even in master by April. And I apologize to folks if we've had conversations that have led them to believe otherwise. That is kind of where I'm coming from right now. I'm very open to being wrong here and being convinced of otherwise, but that is where I'm coming from here. Guy, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I think you have to think about what the utility of a warning message is. And basically, the warning message achieves a few different things. Firstly, it discourages adoption. It discourages users from using a feature or pushing a feature to their users because users don't like warnings. Warnings are not just invisible things in Node. They're very, like, the user interface of Node.js is the console output, and warnings come straight in that console output. So they're, for a lot of use cases, they can't even be a consideration. And especially given that the flexibility around that is pretty much non-existent for controlling that as a user, which is fine. There is benefit in being able to control adoption. And then the other thing they do is make it very clear to users who haven't read the docs and seen the fact that the first line of the docs is a big message saying that this is an experimental feature and it can change. It makes sure that users are aware of the fact that it's not going to be a shock if things get pulled out from under them at any point. At April, we're discussing backporting to 12 LTS. If we think that we have something that we want to discourage adoption from, and that we want to be very clear to users that it will continue to break, then I don't see how backporting to LTS is not as important a thing as removing that warning, and seeing it as a slightly different phase of the experimental status. And then just one last final thing. This process of getting modules into Node.js has taken a very long time, and the idea that our natural tendencies should be towards letting things take longer, I think, is very dangerous for the project when Node.js more than ever needs to be continuing to show that it's able to move forward on things.
Jan is up, and then I have something to add afterwards.
Yeah, I think trying to think through the kinds of differences it would make. I think removing the warning would, to me, at first glance, the biggest difference would be that if I want to publish a CLI tool or start using modules in a CLI tool that I publish to NPM, I could only really realistically do it if the experimental warning is completely removed. I cannot publish a CLI tool as long as the experimental warning is there, because it would just not be reasonably working. So I think there are pretty good reasons for removing the warning rather sooner than later. And I do agree with Guy that the process has been fairly long. And if we unflag and communicate that it is now unflagged, and then basically, in quotation marks, nobody can use it because nobody wants to see constant warnings when they're running their app, I think we are losing a lot of momentum.
So a couple thoughts to add here. Oh shit, we're at 4 o'clock. I'll be really quick, and then I may get kicked out of this room. And then we'll have to end the meeting. So slowing down adoption is potentially a feature, not a bug. The second that we unflag this on LTS, and if we also removed the warning, we will get an exponential curve of more adoption, which also means an exponential curve of more usage of bugs, of reports, of issues. If we have something that we did that was wrong, that was broken, that hasn't surfaced yet because we haven't had that level of adoption, we have that much less flexibility to make larger changes that we need to make. The amount of timeline that we're talking about is difference in n months, not n years. I agree that we've been working on this for a long time, but a lot of the features, I'm getting kicked out. A lot of the features that I'm gonna like walk and talk and try to find a room. A lot of the features that we're talking about having shipped now that we're stabilizing have only really been worked on for N months. Like less than a year have we been working on them and shipping them. They are not as mature as we would like them to be. The last bit here with regards to that would be if we want this to be successful, I think we need to be careful. Also, people can't just start shipping things as long as there's versions of Node that don't support modules. Node.js 10 is still actively being maintained and will continue to be maintained, I believe, until next April. So I'm not saying that we should wait until next April to do all these things, but I do think that there is something to be said about thinking about that as a timeline to which folks can really start shipping modules without breaking folks from underneath them. So I think perhaps if we wanted to sit down and start sketching out what like the worst case timeline looks like versus the best case timeline, maybe what we could do is start sketching out around like, hey, when does 10 go end of life? What are the major milestones between now and then? And where would we like to be with the modules system in each one of those phases so we could be intentional about it? And I'm very willing to change some of my opinions on this. What I think would be really useful is like, let's be holistic. Let's look at like, what are all the major milestones we want to hit? What is the like full timeline in which we're thinking about this? And what is the way in which we can get the best feedback and best set up developers and users for success? Do people feel okay with that? Cool. I know that I have strong opinions, but I promise to be pragmatic about it as much as I can. And with that, I'm late to a meeting. Does anybody, Corey said something about he worries about unflagging in 12 before removing the ESM warning first. I will take an action item to open up an issue and document some of these thoughts, and let's kick off a discussion in there, and then maybe make that like the first agenda item that we dig into in the next meeting. People cool with that? Great. Thanks, everyone. Talk to y'all soon.